Alex, let me start with you about this concept of central banking to the max.
This refers to the actions over the time in the wake of the crisis, or during the crisis and its wake, of the amazing expansion of the Federal Reserve as part of the intervention of the government. And that took the form of both buying the government debt, so that in fact what was happening is the government would issue bonds to finance its deficits, but the Fed would buy a lot of them and just print the money. So if you think of the government as a consolidated entity, we were simply printing to finance the deficits. If you net out the intra-government transactions between the Treasury and the Fed, and what a surprise, we got a big inflation. But the Federal Reserve's actions were similar in the most recent, before this one, crisis, the crisis of 2007, 2009. By the way, the 21st century is only 23 years old, and we've already had 2 giant bubbles and 2 giant crises. That's interesting. That's once every 10 years. That is the long-term historical average for crises. Tori, speaking of, should you expect crises? Yes. Sure.
I feel bad for the millennials.
Now, it wasn't only the Fed that was doing this, however. We point out in our chapter on central banking to the max, which is chapter 12, should anyone be interested, that all the central banks, the major central banks, are in this together. With the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, we also count Bank of Canada, the Swiss National Bank, which is their central bank, and the Fed, and we add them all together, and that is a table 12.7 in chapter 12. Their total assets between 2008 and 2021 went up by 7 times. There was 7 times as big at the end as they were at the beginning. So they went from a total of, adding all those central banks together, of $3.8 trillion to $26.6 trillion. So these were amazing expansion of central bank activities and central bank balance sheet. And we are now living with that. Now with the Fed itself, it not only bought out government debt, it bought out mortgages. This was unprecedented. The amount of mortgages owned by the Federal Reserve from its founding in 1913 until 2007 was exactly 0. In our view, the amount of mortgages owned by the central bank should be 0. Today, it's $2.6 trillion. Now, and in addition to that, there are $5.5 trillion of government debt. Could you say, I'm sorry, let me just answer the question, which I just prefaced in a lengthy fashion to. Could you say the Fed just ought to sell this debt? Now, there are 2 reasons why they won't do that. The first reason is they own it now at huge losses. That is to say, the market value of all these bonds and mortgages is far less than the book value or what they paid. How much less? Well, on September 30th, it was $1.1 trillion less. The Federal Reserve is not going to sell and recognize the losses on its books. The second thing is, of course, if you sell, somebody else has to buy. You're going to put serious upward pressure on interest rates in the market, because before you were putting downward pressure on interest rates. If you're buying and how to sell, you put upward pressure. They don't want to do that. So it won't happen. So what will happen is a very slow unwinding over time as these securities mature, and they're up against a problem. But 4 trillion of these bonds and mortgages have maturities greater than 10 years. So this is a long road ahead.